social distance and whatnot, like Pat and a few folks can kind of go on this side. You kind of know the. Yeah, Michelle, if you want to go maybe on that side. Yeah. That's good. Good disbursement. Okay. Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We are here for what normally is our 11:30 Corona briefing. We had obviously a major incident in our city last night, and so what we're going to do is actually speak to that. And for folks who have questions and so forth about Corona matters, a couple of things, we can certainly take some at the end if people feel that there are urgent questions that they need to ask. Otherwise, we will give a full, a full Corona update on Monday. And so we are going to focus on the incident that happened last night and frankly talk a little bit about racism in America and also where our city is at. And so with that, I want to begin by speaking a little bit about what's happening around our country, specifically in Minneapolis. And I want to talk about George Floyd. And this is an incident that it's been in our hearts and minds over these last few days. And we see the issue continue to be rising in America's consciousness, as it should be, throughout the country. And I know for much of us in our community, we see this too, and we feel everything that's going on there, even if it's not directly happening in our community. But his death has left us, I think, in many ways with rightful anger and with rightful grief. It has highlighted a lot of things wrong with America. Now, it's also a situation where we know that it's not the first time, right? And we know that for weeks, just a few weeks ago, we saw the video of Ahmaud Arbery in the same thing, different context, but the same concept happening time and time again. And I don't have any particular words that are going to express the depth of pain that people feel, but I know that pain is real, and I know that especially for people of color, we are all experiencing that in some way or another right now. And as your mayor, I want to acknowledge that pain, the pain that people are feeling and the grief that they're going through. And I know that here in Albuquerque, we stand with those who are grieving these incidents around the nation, and we also stand with those calling for justice. Now, I've been working with our chief of police over the last 3 years on efforts to restore the trust between APD and our community. And it's a long road to restore that trust. But I know that he is dedicated to it, I am dedicated to it, and I know how important that trust is. And I know that it's not just about all the work we're doing engaging the community and neighborhood leaders. It's also about actions. It's about how we actually engage with each other in tough times as well as in good times. And I also want to note that earlier this morning, our chief denounced the actions of the Minneapolis police officers, and he's going to share some additional words with us after I'm done this morning. But I know for us that the deaths, whether it's George Floyd, whether it's Ahmaud in Georgia, whether it's Breonna in Kentucky, all of these murders took place outside Albuquerque. But it does not mean that Albuquerque is shielded from anti-Black and racist behaviors. And I think that's very important for us to understand. There is a connection. In that connection, we feel even if we're not in that exact city. We know that white people have not done enough to address racism in our country, and that's been the case for decades. We know that on top of all of this, we have the Corona pandemic, exposing and compounding the effects of inequity all across our country. We know that the Black community and people of color, of course right here, our own Native American population, have been horribly disproportionately affected by what's happening. And so on top of all of that, we have folks in the White House stoking racism, violence, and division. During a time of pandemic, when we need compassion and we need leadership most. All of this is coming together in many ways with what we saw last night in our city. And so we're here today. We're stressed out from the pandemic. We have a legacy of discrimination on top of a legacy of violent crime in our city. We know many people have lost jobs. We know many of us are suffering from vast anxiety about the future. Many of us are depressed. Many of us are tired, and many of us are angry. For those of us who are sick, and those of us in communities that have seen young black men killed by law enforcement, this is all tenfold on top of the personal grief that they're feeling. This is, in many ways, what America is going through today, in all different ways, in all different cities across our country. We have to recognize this, and we have to at least try and understand this. And in some ways, in some great ways, Albuquerque is different. But in many ways, we're all in this together with every other city in America. Now for us, the recent hate incidents also have been happening in our own town. We can point to the University of New Mexico Director of Africana Studies. Dr. Becknell is an example of why we cannot be silent in our city about these issues. It means that we have to work together to dismantle racism as best that we can. And it means also that to be silent is complicit. We wanted to speak to these issues today because to not speaking to them, that actually is what I think a lot of people are afraid to do because either it makes us uncomfortable or it makes us angry and everything in between. We are not going to do that here. We are, as we have been, we are going to talk about difficult issues in our community, including racial tension and racism. Now, the city of Albuquerque believes that Black Lives Matter. We are standing in solidarity with the African American community grieving from the reoccurring violence against their community. We know that incidents of anti-Blackness and racism have a long history in our city and throughout our country. We also know that the recent attacks on our local community and across the nation have been made to really invoke fear and disunity. And again, this is coming from the most powerful people in our country, and it's not helping. But I know that in our city, we are not going to buckle under that fear. We are committed to continuing to work to make us a more unified community. That is what One Albuquerque is all about. And know that in this city and in this administration, we each have a responsibility to work together to do what we can to try and dismantle racism. It's a long, long journey, but it's one that we are going to take. We also know that there are times when we want to protest, and there are times when we do protest. There are times when we express frustration with the system and all that we're going through in every way. We know these are incredibly challenging times also for our first responders. And we ask them to keep the public, including the protesters, safe. And that is what they were trying to do last night. Our police department works to avoid confrontation in situations of protest and to de-escalate and avoid violence. They also are always prepared to save lives, should that be the case. Now, this protocol includes appropriate engagement when violence is imminent. And unfortunately, last night, this was the case, where after a relatively peaceful demonstration, reflecting all of the frustration and anger and stress that I talked about just a few minutes ago, after that had dispersed, hours after that had dispersed, dozens of shots were fired, and APD absolutely had to respond. They did it in a way, fortunately, that actually kept everyone safe. And while I know it was scary for many, it was also dangerous for many. When dozens of shots are fired, APD absolutely has to respond to keep everyone safe. That means the neighbors, that means police officers, and that also means the protesters, and that's what they were trying to do last night. Now, here in this city, we strive to dismantle the structures that create the inequity that drives these kinds of events. And we're actively doing things like anti-racism training, even in our own police department. We have teams dedicated to civil rights, some of which you're going to hear from today, as well as equity and inclusion and immigrant and refugee affairs. This work also starts with ourselves, and it means each of us in our own house trying to do things, whether it's understanding the issues that are happening with our country, whether it's talking to each other about them, but also working with what the city is trying to do through our offices of equity and inclusion, trying to build a better city that actually works for everyone. And in this city, we know that we are always going to stand up to divisive rhetoric. In this city, we know that we are going to stand together no matter what our race is or where we came from or how long we've been here. We know that our efforts are not going to let up, and we know that we're going to continue to fight for a peaceful, just, and equitable Albuquerque. For me also, I know this is one of our city's strengths. We have our challenges, there is no doubt, and those surface. And when they surface, we also need to remember that this is, in general, a strong and resilient community that is proud of everyone that is here. And it's a community that has represented folks from all walks of life. And in fact, that is a defining characteristic of what makes Albuquerque special and what makes me grateful to be the mayor of Albuquerque. So the city of Albuquerque and our Albuquerque Police Department are going to continue to work on these issues, as well as our offices of equity, inclusion, and civil rights. We're going to continue educating our workforce and the community around all things anti-racism through our various workshops and equity training initiatives. Now, each of these continues, but we need your help to join in that process and to be part of what we're trying to facilitate. And we need also your help to call out racism and injustice whenever and wherever you see it. And I think that actually is an excellent segue to the woman who's in charge of that for the city, the head of our Civil Rights Office, Tori Jacobus.
Thank you, Mayor Keller. To echo Mayor Keller's statements, Black Lives Matter. Again, Black Lives Matter. A great deal of horror is occurring in our community and our country right now. People are in pain, people are grieving, and people are angry. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Christian Cooper, so much hatred and so much racism in the last few weeks in our country. This has created a volatile situation that took very little to spark. We know that this is a long-standing problem in our country and that local government has played a role in the past in maintaining structural racism. And that's why I'm here. That's why Mayor Keller created the Office of Equity and Inclusion in 2018, so that we can help the rest of the city government to understand the roots of racism and to dismantle the structures wherever we can. All of us, each and every one of us, has a responsibility to do work to dismantle racism and to heal our community. I ask that all of you seek out opportunities to do the anti-racism work and to dismantle racism in Albuquerque and across the country. When you see racism, speak up with conviction against it. When you see discrimination, report it to the appropriate government agencies. Here in Albuquerque, that's the Office of Civil Rights that I lead. To our community, I see your pain. I feel your anger. I hear you. We are in this together. Thank you.
Okay, now we I know our chief of police and the police department gave a briefing. For those of you who didn't see it, it's available. They gave a briefing about 2 hours ago. I do know that, number one, the chief really wants to reiterate the message that he gave. I also know there was some sound technical issues, maybe perhaps for folks trying to hear that as well. So I want to also bring up our chief of police, who is very passionate about these issues, and we're fortunate to have a chief who, as best that he can, tries to understand what's happening and do something about it. Chief?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Across the nation right now, there's a lot of communication among law enforcement leaders regarding this incident in Minneapolis. I can tell you this, as police chiefs and such are in major organizations representing police chiefs have expressed not only their concern but their outrage based on that incident. We know that the death of Mr. Floyd is deeply disturbing and should be of concern to everybody in this country. On behalf of APD and the city of Albuquerque, I would like to offer our sympathy and condolences to the Floyd family. Those officers' actions are inconsistent with the trainings, policies, and protocols of the Albuquerque Police Department. We have worked tirelessly to build trust between law enforcement and the community that we are sworn to protect. What occurred in Minneapolis is an unfortunate reminder of how quickly bad policing can undermine that trust. The law enforcement profession must do better, and we must hold ourselves to a higher standard. Our officers are trained to treat all individuals with dignity and respect. This is the essence of the principles of procedural justice. Like APD, most agencies across the nation have taught their officers to de-escalate critical situations and avoid the use of force when possible. We will not tolerate these actions, and we denounce any type of police brutality. The senseless misconduct demonstrated in this unfortunate incident should not define other police departments across our nation. APD denounces the behavior of the Minneapolis officers, and we will continue to build the trust we have established with the community we so proudly serve. Thank you.
Okay, now I want to introduce our next speaker on this issue, and for a couple of important reasons. He's the city councilor of the International District, the area, of course, which I used to represent, and now he does in the city council. And he's also our council president. I know this is a very important issue for city council as well. Council President Pat Davis.
Thanks, Mayor. Before we talk about what happened in Albuquerque last night, let's take a few steps back to a few days ago in Minneapolis. I think, based on what we've all seen so far, it's absolutely clear how those officers handled Mr. Floyd was wrong. To me, it was criminal. And as someone who used to wear a badge and served as a police officer, quite frankly, it angers me to watch that happen. And no police officer in the country, as our chief said, has been trained that way. We know better. And no matter what they thought Mr. Floyd had done, they had violated their duty of care to take care of him and the community. And our own community has been through this before. The city council called in the Department of Justice years ago to help us stop the needless shootings and unnecessary escalations of encounters with law enforcement. And past actions by federal agents and this past summer's state police surge, aggressive policing by the sheriff's department, mostly in the International District, are evidence to a lot of our residents, including myself, that we still have a long way to go in our own city towards being responsible about how we police and engage with our community. And quite frankly, as proud as I am about how far APD has come, I'm worried that we're seeing some of those same patterns repeat themselves in the county. Our nerves are frayed, and our residents, and particularly residents in black and brown communities in our city, are right to be angry. They're right to protest. They're right to demand more of government at every level, including ours. And that's exactly what our community members and leaders were doing yesterday during the day. But we will not let those people in our community working for justice be co-opted by a few disruptors who chose to use violence, particularly gun violence, to try to recklessly endanger our community. Look, in a community that has been plagued by gun violence, our APD officers did exactly what we've asked them to do to be a partner with our community. Learning of an active shooter driving through our neighborhoods, shooting recklessly at neighbors and homes indiscriminately, they responded. They responded cautiously and carefully. They set up a plan. They didn't provoke a shooting. They took appropriate action and took these folks into custody. Without APD intervention yesterday, I have no doubt, and Chief, please extend our appreciation. I know how scary it is to be there on that street watching and trying to figure out how to do that. I have no doubt that without APD intervention yesterday, the conversation we'd be having this morning would be very different about what happened in our community. But look, we're all angry, myself included, about what we saw on TV in Minneapolis. But I'm also really angry watching the scenes from our own city last night because last night saw two very different events. The latter was dangerous. The people who organized it and the leaders behind it used the same tools of violence to attack and divide and endanger our neighborhoods. And they're the very neighborhoods that we're working so hard to try to end, where we're trying to end that scourge of violence. Those are not the community leaders that they've promised or proclaimed that they want to be. Nor are they the leaders we've chosen to follow in these efforts. I hope they're held accountable for putting our police officers and our community in danger and for adding new scars to the community that was on a path to healing with our city and with our police department. So as we all learn more about this story, I want to implore the media and the community to help us make that distinction. Let's elevate the voices working for justice, who organized together, who cooperated as a community, who denounced violence, whether it is police in community or whether it is violence in our community members. One act of violence does not allow or encourage or justify another. And we have to do our job to be sure we make that distinction and elevate the proper voices and hold accountable the folks who put our community in danger. And I want to thank APD and our city for helping to do that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Council President. Now, let's hear a little bit from our COO, Lawrence Rales here. Again, want to remind folks that we wanted to directly address this issue both nationally and in our community. We also know that, like all of us, there is this context of Corona and so forth. So we want to give a little bit of guidance going into the weekend, and then again, we'll pick up that specifics in terms of reopening and all that on Monday. But Lawrence is going to speak to a few things now.
Thanks, Mayor. Just wanted to give a little update on a couple of events that are occurring or a couple of announcements that were made that will obviously give people in the community some information. So Loveless Medical Center and Vitalent are holding 2 blood drives at the parking lot of Longfellow Elementary, located at the corner of Dr. Martin Luther King Avenue and Walter Street. The dates and times are as follows: Monday, June 1st from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. and then on Tuesday, June 2nd from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. People can reserve a time at bloodhero.com, or they can call 505-246-1457. Again, these are blood drives that are being held here in the downtown area. Today, the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department's State Parks Division announced 9 additional state parks opening for day use only beginning tomorrow. And for those of you who have been wanting to get out in the water, that includes Elephant Butte State Park. That'll get people out there at least to cool down for the weekend, hopefully. 5 more parks will open on June 1st. Overnight use and campgrounds remain closed, and all events through June 19th have been canceled. So just remember, these are just day use parks openings for now. In addition, there will be capacity limits to many of the state parks. So the best thing to do, quite frankly, is call the State Parks Division and reserve a camping spot so that you don't drive to a park and then all of a sudden you find that the park is full, and then you're out of luck a bit. So those are the important announcements and information we wanted to get out to people for this weekend. As the mayor said, on Monday we will have more detailed information about city programs, city facilities, and what we're doing to keep not only our city employees safe during this COVID issue, but also what we're doing to support feeding our young children in the community during the summer, and all the other opportunities that we'll have before us as per the governor's latest, if you will, announcement on her executive order and the changes that she's made. So with that, Mayor, thank you.
Okay, now we can take some questions on this, and I think, Alicia, are you working on those? Or?
Any questions in person? Sure, I have a few. Were the 3 people who were arrested last night and then released, were they found to have any weapons on them, and were they underage?
So the question is some details about the folks last night involved in that were actually arrested. And what I can do, what we typically do is I can ask Chief Medina to speak to that, or we can follow up with you. I'm not even sure if he knows that information at this point. Okay, Deputy Chief Medina.
We had 4 individuals who were detained due to the complexity of the investigation. Nobody was booked. We've identified them. We're working on obtaining search warrants. There were 3 juveniles and 1 adult that was detained.
Did they have any weapons on them when you detained them?
We don't know that information right now. When they got out of the vehicle, obviously officers didn't find anything on them, but we're yet to serve a search warrant on the vehicle to see if we've recovered any firearms.
Are you looking for other suspects at this time?
I don't believe we're looking for any other suspects at this time.
Okay, other questions? And actually, it was Alicia doing the, okay, we can go back to you.
So just one moment while she.
Who has the, okay, my bad.
Alicia.
Okay, go ahead.
Are you concerned that the actions last night were an excessive use of force, perhaps in violation of the consent decree?
So the question is around different concerns about force being used last night in the consent decree. We have, as we've demonstrated over the last several years, a very strong team that will investigate that. So all incidents are investigated. And what I am confident is that team will make the right determination. And so right now, this is being treated just like every other situation that the department comes across.
Is there any thought to having independent investigators from the outside evaluate the situation?
The question is about independent folks from the outside, and I'd say that's always the case right now. So the Police Oversight Board will no doubt be involved in this, as will all the independent folks associated with the DOJ. We are one of the most watched departments in the country right now by independent folks, and this case will be no different.
Chief Medina confirmed this morning that the same protest preparations were not made in advance of the anti-shutdown protests on Civic Plaza. Last night's show and use of force included the armored car, a helicopter, unmarked police cars, 2 city busloads of police officers outfitted in military-grade gear, tear gas, and military-grade guns. These were deployed when there were about 50 protesters left. Why were these demonstrations handled differently?
So the question is about the differences between this and other demonstrations. I'm going to let Chief Medina speak to his comments or maybe clarify some of those, but in general, as I stated, our department is always ready for every protest, and I do know that a lot of the things that you discussed are at pretty much every protest. And so what is different is if they're roving through streets as opposed to stationary, so that obviously requires a different approach. And I also know that whenever shots are fired and there is, actual gunfire driving through neighborhoods, that is a completely different situation than any of the protests, at least recently, that we've seen. And so therefore, it does require a different response. But in terms of setup and planning, we are prepared for those outcomes pretty much for every protest.
I think it's important to remember and to understand that we do prepare for all gatherings and all protests the same way. It's just our officers last night, our ERT teams were deployed because we were no longer dealing with a protest. Our ERT team wasn't deployed to the protesters. It was deployed to help the officers who were trying to take 4 individuals who we believe were armed with a firearm, firing shots into custody when a small portion of individuals came and approached them, and we needed to make sure our officers were safe. Every major incident where we have a major protest, we always have a contingency of officers prepared. Depending on the size of the incident or how many individuals we think coming in will determine how many individuals we have prepared. Like I stated earlier, due to the fact that this was a larger incident, we had more officers prepared to respond to the incident than we have had in other incidents. The previous incident you spoke about, we did have officers prepared, but because we had a smaller amount of people that were attending, we had a smaller amount of officers prepared for that incident.
At the point that they were deployed, though, there were only about 50 demonstrators, from what I'm hearing.
And I think that we got to keep it in context that we were dealing with a situation where shots had been fired, we were dealing with armed individuals, and we weren't deploying those resources necessarily for the individuals who were protesting up the block at Wyoming and Central. We were deploying them for the officers who found themselves surrounded as they were trying to process a crime scene. So I want to keep those 2 incidents very separate from each other, because the mass group of individuals who were protesting were at the location of Wyoming and Central. The individuals who were taken into custody for on the firearms charges or pending charges, they were at Mesilla and Central. It's 2 different locations, and the reason that team was brought in is because a small portion of individuals chose to respond to this area, and they started committing damage, and we had to make sure that our officers were protected so that we could retreat them from the situation. So there's 2 separate situations there. A protest which we recognized and we saw at Wyoming and Central, and officers trying to take some individuals into custody related to firearm use at Mesilla and Central.
Was the damage against police cars appearing at Mesilla and Central?
Yes.
Okay, we have a lot of questions to get through, so switching gears a little bit here. This question comes from Chris McKee at KRQE. A question about COVID-19. We've already seen some Albuquerque restaurants with issues enforcing social distancing requirements and mask wearing for customers waiting for tables. For example, at Albuquerque's Westside Hooters just last night. Is the city going to ramp up its enforcement of COVID-safe practices at these types of businesses?
So the question is around COVID-safe practices now that restaurants, again, this weekend, their patios, by the way, should just be open. So hopefully that restaurant was not open inside. But the city's going to play a similar role to we have been in the past with this, where if there are egregious situations, we will go in and do education with the business owners. Other than that, of course, the state has been in charge of enforcement on these issues since this began. We do have Dr. Mark Demena here. Do you want to provide any additional guidance on that?
Thank you, Mayor. Today I'm going to be putting back on my environmental health hat and not so much talking about public health issues that we've been talking about. So environmental health obviously is going to be enforcing issues at restaurants as we do under any normal circumstances. Right now we are all sort of adjusting to a new normal, what those new types of conditions are that restaurants are allowed to operate in. We've already received some complaints about exactly that nature of situation where potentially social distancing isn't being observed. The complaints may be alleging that the restaurant isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. It may also be alleging that the customers aren't cooperating. So far, the inspectors have gone out and they've found some conditions that are actually very much in compliance. The restaurateurs are trying to do exactly what we're asking them to do. If we find that's not the case, as we've done throughout this, our enforcement is going to start off being very much education, outreach, trying to make sure that the restaurant owners understand what we're asking them to do. Obviously, there's going to be some give and take there with customers as well. If the customers choose not to wear masks while they're waiting for tables or they're in the parking lot, it is still the public health order. It is still the requirement that people wear a mask and cover their face in public. So we're going to ask customers to do that as well. The restaurants have a little bit of a difficult time trying to enforce customers doing that. So those conditions might be looked into. As long as the restaurants are doing what we're asking them to do, keeping the tables spaced out, as the mayor just reinforced, it's supposed to be patios only right now, then there's not an issue. But we're going to start off by trying to make sure that we're doing education there, make sure they understand exactly what we're doing, that we're emphasizing that this is a continued public health effort. We want to make sure people are safe as we try to gradually reopen so that we can continue on that path. And we expect most of those issues will be dealt with just in terms of an education and outreach to stop by. If that's not the case, if we have folks that are willfully just trying to cram tables together, pack their customers in, not taking some of those steps to space people out as they come up, then we will deal with that accordingly and pass that along for enforcement as well.
Thank you. Another question from KRQE. What do you say to businesses who feel uncomfortable about urging customers to wear a mask and feel that the issue of mask wearing enforcement is being placed almost entirely on their shoulders?
The question is about that responsibility for mask wearing and so forth. And, you know, for us, I think it's really appropriate to check in with the Department of Health on that. They have, I think, the best way to kind of approach that. But I would just remind folks that it's actually for everyone else's safety, including the business, right? So if you're a business, you actually want folks wearing a mask, and hopefully also so you can facilitate commerce. And so it really just helps all of us and keeps us safe. And so it's a good way for us individually to try and do what we can to keep businesses open, but while remain safe.
Thank you, Mayor. One question here from Brittany Costello at GOV. How is the city of Albuquerque helping restaurants this weekend with patio dining? In addition, state guidance and city officials will be offering any guidance or help over the weekend with patio dining.
Yeah, so over the weekend, we want to remind folks, and we put this out, the details were released, I think, on Wednesday about patio dining, and I want to remind folks that definitely call the planning department or just call 311 and ask for the planning department, because there are a number of ways to expand your patio dining, for example, in a sidewalk, perhaps even a parking lot, but it does have to be made safe for ADA compliance, and of course, if it's near a street, it needs to be safe for traffic. And so our planning department is waiving all fees right now, and they're able to walk you through how to do that in a way that is also compliant and safe.
switching back a little to the APD situation, this is a question from Matt Risen at the Albuquerque Journal. If APD could do it over again, is there any way they would have handled last night's situation differently?
The question is, if they could do it over again, would anything be handled differently? And I can certainly tee up one of our chiefs maybe to mention that. I mean, I would just say every day, everything I do, there are ways I could have done things better. So I'm sure there's always room for improvement. Anything specific you want to add?
The only thing I would like to add is, last night when the traffic stop occurred on the vehicle on Mesilla, our officers tried to process the scene as they typically do. That's calling out a field investigator, sealing the car for a warrant, leaving the car undisturbed so that it could be processed for evidence inside of the vehicle. The one thing we would have done different is, we would have had an officer jump in that car and drive it to a substation and take it out of the situation, and we would have also had the prisoners immediately placed into vehicles and taken out of the scene. As soon as we figured out that we had to get out of that scene quicker than we were better off. So one of the plans that we came up with last night that we briefed our investigative bureau about this morning with their deputy chief was that when these incidents occur, that they need to be prepared to have one person available to remove the car quickly, and that our goal is to get suspects out of the area, and we'll conduct our investigation and process all our evidence at a different location and explain our actions during the course of the investigation in the police report.
Okay.
Next question comes from Hannah Colton at KUNM. As demonstrators protest the killing of an unarmed black man killed while face down, do Albuquerque police recognize that repeating that image on Albuquerque streets is likely to exacerbate tensions in this moment?
Well, to answer that question first, I'm relieved that I believe the officer in Minneapolis was finally charged with murder. I think that just came out, and so finally, that hopefully there will be justice. In terms of, I think it's very important to understand that if people are shooting a gun driving through our town, we need to do something to keep our citizens safe, as well as protesters. And that's a very different situation. So I think there obviously, as I spoke to at length in the beginning, there's a lot of connection indirectly to these issues. But what happened last night was very different than what happened in Minneapolis.
Thank you, Mayor. A follow-up question from Hannah Colton. In a time when tensions are high between police and residents across the country, especially people of color, are you concerned that last night's actions by APD will spark anger and further erode trust with the department?
I think the question was, just concerns going forward about the tense situation right now all across our country between police departments and civilians. And, for me, it's something that we want to make sure that there is no violence. And so at the end of the day, right, that is what the protests in some ways are about. And that's also why we obviously have to have public safety. And so what we cannot have is people shooting firearms driving through neighborhoods. That concerns me a lot. Obviously, what happened in Minneapolis concerns me deeply and is terrible. But I also know that any city does not want protesters actually shooting weapons. We can't have that. Protesting is part of what we do as Americans, and that happens. And I certainly expect that throughout our city oftentimes. We've already had several protests, of course, in the last few months. So that is expected, but that's very different than shooting a firearm.
If APD thinks they have the right people, why were they released?
So the question is, why were folks released? And, I think APD was trying to do what's best to keep people safe. With respect to those details, it's probably going to be up to, I would imagine, the courts or a district attorney. So we'll see if they were or not, as we do in every situation.
Thank you, Mayor. We have a follow-up question from Hannah Colton. Was the fact that last night's demonstration took place in the International District, a neighborhood with the largest number of African Americans in the state, a factor of how the police prepared to respond?
So the question was, was the racial background of an area equated to our response? And of course not. Our response is always calibrated to the number of people and the amount of danger and threat that there is. And it doesn't matter who's involved. Also, I'm not sure that statement is true, by the way. So I would check with the African American community, because I'm pretty sure that's not the highest concentration in the state. Okay. All right. Thanks. We'll see you again Monday. Thank you.
It was great, but you opened the elephant view and everybody's headed south.